I'm certainly not in a position to say what the U.S. should be doing. Until now, prospects for any direct intervention with major U.S. role have been very limited, and primarily due to U.S. own genuine reluctance to intervene for its own reasons, not at all primarily because of the constraining effect of, say, Russia or China veto. But I think that greater internationalization of the Syria crisis, including in some form of international security involvement, cannot be excluded as the military deadlock persists and as humanitarian situation deteriorates sharply. I would say that this prospect would become even less hypothetical if and after the events in Syria take the worst possible course. Not the one described by Amr, that's probably the best possible course, but the worst possible course, which is what Lakhdar Brahimi calls Somalization, basically where if the conflict leads to almost total disintegration of governance, politics, economy, society. In that case, even a possibility of direct humanitarian intervention by coalition of the willing may not be excluded, however much the United States, as we've heard this morning, will try to avoid it. I mean, the situation may reach a point where they no longer be able to avoid it, and hopes that this Somalization international humanitarian intervention scenario could be prevented by, establishing a no-fly zone, charging NATO with managing and monitoring it to allow national coalition, sort of proto-government to function, and then quell inevitable retaliation by Assad by surgical strikes. I mean, to me, that doesn't look something that may prevent further sort of escalation and intervention.
All right.
So I have no direct advice to the U.S. at the moment.
The Obama administration certainly seems to be looking for advice. We're going to open the floor to questions now. We'll take a few at a time, the three over there, and then I'll distribute to the panelists, and then we'll move to the other side. Please introduce yourself, and if I could ask you to kindly keep the questions short, and please don't make any statements. We'll leave that to the panelists.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an intelligence analyst. Honorable Al-Assam, I view the slaughter of Alawites post-Assad as inevitable, a Shatila, Sabra kind of situation. Is there any talk of a rapid reaction force to protect those people once Assad falls? And Dr. Stepanova, is there any chance at all that we can get the Frankenstein coalition to promise not to eject the Russian submarine base at Kardas, that might result in a change at the UN vote?
Whether there's any fear that the Alawites might be massacred after, and if there's a way to protect them. We'll take one more.
My name is Hassan, Global Bridges for Humanity. As I was hearing the discussion of the panel, it seems that there is a concerted effort yet to Shia and Sunni fight each other without knowing what kind of implication it's going to have for all the people in the world. That area produces 20 million barrels of oil every day. That's going to go up in smoke. So what is the panel's suggestion? Should they promote this kind of thing or try to tell the people the complications or the things that are going to happen to the whole world?
Right. I'll take a last one. I'll remind you all of the questions.
Hi, my name is Dr. Asi Daoud. I'm a professor at American University. My question is for Mr. Amr al-Azam. The first question, in spending my time with the Syrian opposition recently in Cairo and Tahrir and so forth, and witnessing the formulation of the SNC by Burhan al-Ghayyoun last year in Cairo, my question to you is, you mentioned that you have been in exile from Syria for many years, and this is precisely the problem in Syria on ground amongst not unifying the the opposition. They've tried in Qatar, and hopefully that will work. But essentially, the mistrust of foreign exiles from Syria and on ground for Syrians who've been living in Egypt. And while in the international community they are supporting a possible regime change with Syrian exiles, how do you think you will approach the mistrust in Syria? And secondly, my question is for Dr. Ekaterina. The first question, if you could comment more on, I didn't hear it being mentioned, the possible negotiations between a Syria-Russia gas pipeline. And then secondly, can you also comment on the cultural influence of Russia in Syria, particularly what I witnessed amongst meeting many Syrians is that they're very trusting of the Russian media, more so than the Western media, and particularly those who support al-Assad regime. So I think the influence of Russia goes deeper than many of the things that you discussed.
Thank you. Let's start with Ahmed, if you want to address both questions about the protection of the Alawites and the opposition.
Okay, I will try and address these. Obviously, the narrative that somehow the Alawites are going to be massacred was a narrative that was initially instigated and begun by the regime. In fact, right from the very beginning, the regime has tried to turn this into a sectarian conflict, even though this wasn't the case. I remember the early protests where people would walk out hand in hand saying we're all brothers and so on and so forth. But as the violence increased, as the regime's repression of these protests became extreme, and as more and more violence, was brought to bear, it became increasingly hard to hold this together. We started, and I and many others started to monitor the level of, if you want, sectarian rhetoric that we began to see emerging from our side as an opposition, and some of it is quite unpleasant. Ultimately, you can't say, no, this will never happen. Okay, and there's already some parts of Syria that have been ethnically cleansed by one group or the other. And these are, unfortunately, the outcomes of a sectarian type civil war. But do not forget that this was very much instigated and begun by the regime, and it will be up to us as an opposition to try and ensure that such a thing does not escalate, does not happen, and that's all I can say. Regarding the other one, just by correction, I have not been in exile for very long. Even though I came to live in the United States in 2006, I've been going back and forth. In fact, I worked as a consultant for the palace right up.
Everybody had hope about reform.
I know, we all had hope right until 2011. In fact, my contract ran out March 2011. So I
consider yourself lucky.
Yeah, I know, very lucky, very convenient. They were very angry with me because I took their money and ran. Anyway, but you're right. There is a problem of this issue of exiles and the external opposition versus the internal opposition. And in fact, even those who were inside who came out, within a few weeks or a month, they also became external opposition, and that opened up that gap. I think this is not easy to address, and will always continue. As the uprising sort of goes on and on, a new cadre the old cadre either have to leave, or are arrested, or are killed, and new cadre are constantly being brought out, new generations of leaders and activists. And so you're always going to have that, and what the new coalition has tried to do, and I don't know if they've done it successfully or not, is to try and increase the presence, the share of the internal opposition, and make sure that they have a voice. I think by having, Suhair Attasi and by having Riyad Saif, both who are very much still identified with the internal opposition rather than the external one, like Burhan Ghalioun, like Taifour, like those guys, and also even with Muaz al-Khatib, who still very much is considered to be a fresh face, are all intended to be, seen as such. So we'll see how that's addressed.
And Geneive or Randa, would you like to say the question about the Sunni-Shia tension?
Go ahead. Well, I think that it's important to try to distinguish, I guess, what is a direct cause from the conflict and what is being manipulated and sort of connected to the conflict. So I think that in Bahrain, for example, because of the long history of Shia oppression in Bahrain, there is this great sense that this finally, after many decades, this sectarian conflict now is sort of coming to a head. I think in Lebanon, of course, it's a lot different, and I'll just speak narrowly about the part of this that I've researched, which is to conduct interviews with some of the Alawite preachers. And I would say that, yes, a lot of these sheikhs have been in Lebanon a long time, and they're not necessarily, they don't have any sort of form, some of them aren't formally educated. And so they very much are creating this kind of street movement and capitalizing on the Syrian conflict, even though they never probably 3 years ago spoke in these kind of sectarian terms. But they're using it for their own sort of self-serving purposes to create a following. As Randa mentioned, there's a Sheikh Asir. He admits he's been in Lebanon. He has his mosque for many years, but he never was on television. He wasn't a public figure.
Yes, it is really as much about sectarianism as it is about politics.
Well, it's about politics, but it's become somewhat the narrative that I think is being crafted for various useful purposes is a sectarian narrative.
And Ekaterina, lastly, if you could address, obviously, the questions about Russia, if you could keep it a little bit brief so we can move on to the other questions.
Well, I'll try my best. First, the gentleman's question was, will Russia, as far as I understood it, trade a UN vote? I assume to approve perhaps no-fly zones, if it would be asked in the first place. Because I think they may do it without a mandate. But will Russia be ready to trade its UN vote for if France and Britain would keep a Tartu facility? I think this is a very good illustration of what I was talking, first of all, of gross exaggeration. First, have you seen this facility? I mean, these two storage houses. I mean, yes, the first, it's nothing. Second, gross exaggeration in the strategic importance of these things. A gross exaggeration of Russia's leverage over Syrian regime. But also, I had no time to speak about how Russia's policy evolved, because it did evolve. But if you want a constant, a thing that is unlikely to change, that's precisely Russia's position on the use of force. I mean, Russia is unlikely to reverse its position on the use of force in Syria, at least as long, I would say, as the Assad regime keeps fighting, or we may say actively agonizes, which it can do, as we know, for a very long time. So do not even count on major change here. I mean,